to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens. Welcome back, listeners, to Season 11 of Hotel Bar Sessions. My name is Lee Johnson, and I am still joined by my fabulous co-hosts, Dr. Rick Lee and Dr. David Gunkel. And today we are talking about evidence. But before we get into that, let's get some drink orders and some rants or raves. So, Rick, let me go to you first.
Today, I'm going to have a Kolsch from local brewery Solemn Oath called Lou. I'm feeling in a Kolsch kind of mood with Kolsch kind of weather. And I am raving about being a tourist in your own hometown. So the three of us are pretty lucky that we live in really great cities. It's not so often when you're living your day-to-day life that you go and see the things that make your city great. And then you have visitors come from out of town and you get a chance to be a tourist in your own hometown. I'll just put in one plug. For the first time in my life, I took what is called the water taxi in Chicago, which goes on the river from basically downtown to Chinatown. And it's a great ride. So I love being a tourist in my own hometown.
Nice. David, what about you?
So I have to stick with a sparkling water because I did my own empirical testing and evidence collecting last night in a bar with my son, and I learned that I can't keep up with a 20-year-old.
Those were the days.
Those were the days, exactly. And I will be ranting about the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is one of those online resources that a lot of people utilize. I've used it, my students have used it, and it's a pretty useful resource. Recently, Eric Schwitzgebel put together a list of the most cited philosophers in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And big surprise, it's a bunch of white guys. And most of them speak English. You don't even get a non-English philosopher until you get down to 103 with Habermas.
Wow.
So this does show us that this discipline that we're in really has a diversity problem. And it has to be addressed not only in the way we hire new colleagues, but it surely needs to be addressed in how we codify the canon of philosophy, because it is no longer an Anglo-American game. It's global. And the encyclopedias, I think, need to reflect this.
I am as shocked as Louis was in Casablanca to find out there was gambling in that establishment. Lee, what about you? What are you drinking, and are you ranting or raving?
I'm just going to have 2 fingers of Buffalo Trace and a rock today, and I am raving about forks. No, I'm not raving about the utensil, although those also are awesome. I am raving about Forks, the episode of the television series The Bear.
Oh.
So this is the 7th episode of the 2nd season of The Bear, which you can watch on Hulu. I am pretty convinced that this might be the most perfect hour of television ever made. I really encourage everyone to watch it. It's amazing how much character development and storytelling they can do with so little dialogue in 1 hour. It's also just beautifully shot and beautifully composed. So highly recommend Forks, both the utensil and the episode from The Bear. So today we are talking about evidence, and Rick is going to guide us through this conversation. So Rick, how do you want to do this?
In court cases, the prosecution and the defense, or the plaintiff and the defendant, often present evidence that either something happened or didn't happen. And what's interesting about the function of evidence there is that there are these truths that are brought to light that indicate something other than themselves, that something else happened or something else is the case. This becomes more crucial lately, I think. We can go back to discussions of global climate change and then to the pandemic, where debates over evidence and what counts as evidence really came to the fore. This has sort of slipped out of the courtroom, slipped out of that region of philosophy we normally call epistemology, that is having to do with knowledge and how knowledge works, and slipped into our public discourse and our political discourse and our everyday life. I think that it's time that we talk about evidence and see what's at the bottom of it. I think we should start season 11 off with the Johnson question. Evidence. What is it?
Well, I think that's a hard question to answer because there are a lot of different kinds of evidence. Depending on what domain you're talking about, whether it's the law or academia or just everyday relations, different types of evidence are going to have different kinds of weight. So in the sciences, empirical evidence is really important. In the courts, testimonial evidence or documentary evidence or forensic evidence is really important. In business and demographic research, statistical evidence is going to be really important. But then also just in our interactions with one another, there's other kinds of evidence that we rely on, like anecdotal evidence. So it's hard to say what evidence is, but all of those, I think, are meant to point us to grounds for believing that something is true.
And I think one of the problems that happens when we are working with evidence is when we shift from one framework to another framework.
Oh, yeah.
And you offer a piece of evidence that you think is a ground for your belief or your claim, and the people you're talking to have a different way of understanding evidence. And as a result, you get a conflict, not about the actual evidence per se, but about what people think evidence is and what qualifies as evidence.
When I started thinking about this question of evidence, I thought that I was pretty sure I knew what it meant, and I thought I could come up with a definition to cover all of these different kinds of evidence that Lee pointed out. And it never occurred to me, even though I spend several hours every day reading Latin texts, to think about the etymology of this. At the center of this is the word videre, which means to see. And so it has to do with bringing something out into visibility. This suddenly made the whole thing very interesting to me because I started thinking about that line from Paul, that faith is evidence of things not seen. And I thought, well, that's bullshit because evidence is evidence of things not seen. That is, evidence is always a pointer towards something that isn't quite known, isn't visible. And so then I thought this is now a really interesting topic because on the one hand, we think evidence, especially empirical evidence, well, that gives us facts, but if it's evidence for something else, we're actually after a different fact. This has become, for me, in the last week or so, a really interesting topic, much more than I thought it ever would have been.
This focus on visibility, I think, is really crucial because in Western philosophy, optics plays a very large role in epistemology and truth. It's about bringing things into the light. It's about exposing. It's about uncovering. And it shows the extent to which, because of our bias to vision, we understand truth and evidence in visual terms. But obviously, those are not the only senses we possess.
Yeah, and what's also interesting in that relation is the use of the phrase in philosophy, but maybe it comes up elsewhere, of things that are self-evident. Well, even in the Declaration of Independence, right, we hold these truths to be self-evident. That becomes an interesting moment in which the thing carries its own uncovering within itself or isn't in need of further uncovering. I'm wondering if it is actually the case that there is something that is self-evident. For the reasons you were just saying, David, like if it is an uncovering with all of this reliance in the history of the West, not just philosophy, on light as a metaphor for truth and visibility as the model for all forms of knowledge, it becomes more and more difficult to understand how something can bring itself to light and what that exactly would mean.
Well, I think we're getting at what are the conditions under which we would require evidence. And most of the time, that has to do with an intersubjective relation. Someone else is claiming something, and you need evidence for that claim, or you are claiming something and need to provide evidence for someone else. I don't think we have quite the same relation to evidence when we're demonstrating truths to ourselves. I don't know. Do you think?
Well, this in some ways goes back to the bad faith episode, right? That I don't think I need evidence in cases in which I probably should look for some evidence because I provide my own evidence for myself, as much in bad faith as that would be.
Right.
But when I say such a thing to you, you would probably demand evidence for it. For example, I have this habit that when I put the dishes away from out of the dishwasher after having washed them, I put the ones that I just cleaned on the bottom, so I rotate the dishes. That's because the dishes wear out. Now, that's self-evident to me, but I could tell by the look on your faces
that it's weird.
that you want evidence of the wearing out of dishes.
Yeah.
I think evidence becomes an issue when you have to defend your view of something, your understanding of the world in one way or another. So you look at the court case. The reason why you need evidence is because there's a contest. One side says X, the other side says not X. And I think you're exactly right, Rick. When it's something that we do in our own self-enclosed arranging of dishes, we never have to really justify that to anybody else. But now you just had to give us evidence, justify to us why it is you do this and explain this crazy behavior of yours such that we don't think you're insane.
It's crazy until proven otherwise.
I mean, even though in your own internal monologue, you might have said to yourself before, I'm going to arrange the dishes this way after I wash them because I'm worried about them wearing out. I doubt that you would have said to yourself, this is evidence for doing it this way, right? It's only when you have to formulate it as a position or as a claim, as David just said, that the evidence arises qua evidence.
I probably didn't know the reason why until someone caught me doing this and then asked me, why are you doing that? And then I had to come up with the reason for it and the evidence.
And to take this one step further then, not only is evidence necessary in a social, relational situation, but evidence itself becomes socially constructed because each person gets to define and characterize what they take as evidence. Outside of this social, intersubjective encounter, a lot of this is really not operative.
I'm going to ask you to pump the brakes there, David, because you're starting to sound like some of my students who say everyone gets to make up their own evidence. Sleeping a little too close to the edge of the bed with that one.
I'm not going to say that everyone gets to make up their own evidence, but everyone gets to characterize what it is that they are taking as evidence. And therefore, there is a dialogue and a contest around how the evidence is characterized and what counts as evidence. For example, again, in a situation in which you have a contest between two parties, whether it be in scientific debate, philosophical debate, or even in a court case, each side is trying to look at the same data and begin to shape it to fit their narrative. That is a social process, right? There's a way in which that is done against the position of another party that is coming at it from another perspective.
But aren't there overarching rules still that apply to everyone? That is, some things are evidence and some things are not evidence. I could present something as evidence of a claim or a position, but it would be entirely legitimate rejoinder to say that is not evidence. I mean, even in court cases, right, we say that doesn't count as evidence.
Right. And I think in a court case, what you have is the prosecution presents all this evidence, and it's the defense's job to say all of those things that are presented, if true, are not evidence that this crime was committed or wasn't committed in the way that they argue it was, and so on. I could raise another example, and that is that back in the 60s, when the Surgeon General announced that smoking causes cancer, it wasn't known what the mechanism of that was. So no one had done studies to see, is it the tar? Is it the nicotine? Is it the heat? What's going on? What the Surgeon General presented as evidence was statistical evidence, that if you look at the incidence of people who smoke who have lung cancer versus the non-smoking population, it's way higher, and therefore we're entitled to say smoking causes cancer. Now, because of the mechanism not being found, that opened the door for the evil tobacco companies to come in and say, aha, well, you haven't proven that smoking causes cancer. You've just shown that there is a statistical correlation. And so then they opened a debate about what counts as evidence here. And they were arguing the Surgeon General didn't have evidence.
And we have something similar with the scientific method, right? In the scientific method, you offer a hypothesis, and then you collect the evidence to support your hypothesis. But other scientists can debate with you about what counts as evidence in resolving this particular hypothesis. And this is a common way in which we engage with evidence. We have the belief up front and we look for the evidence afterward as a way to support it.
Yeah.
I feel like that's how a lot of our life goes, is that we have a commitment first and we only then backfill it when called to account. And so this is back to Lee's point that it seems like evidence, much like perhaps also morality, is something that's always kind of retrospective, that I have the commitment first and then I ground it later, and usually only when called to account.
So why is it, do you think, that the standards for evidence aren't uniform across these different domains in our life? I'm thinking, for example, in the sciences, you have what's sometimes called the Sagan standard, right? Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. It's a very, very high standard for evidence. And in the field of law, there are rules of evidence, what counts as evidence, what doesn't count as evidence. And sometimes otherwise good evidence can be thrown out because the acquisition of that evidence violated one of the rules. But then in our regular day-to-day life, I think I have much more lax rules about what counts as evidence. Just to use something entirely anecdotal, like, should I trust this guy? Should I trust this mechanic?
Right,
Or, whatever. Or just this person, I'm largely going to rely on what people I trust say about that person. Why wouldn't we have the same high standards of evidence across all of these domains? Is it just because the stakes are different?
I would say that there are two things involved here. One is the stakes. In many instances, it's not going to affect my life one way or the other, whether something turns out to be the case or not be the case. I'm not that invested in it, and so if you say it's the case, okay, fine. In other instances, the stakes are much higher. Global climate change, the stakes are really, really high. And there, I'm not going to trust any old Joe saying, oh, yeah, but the climate changes all the time, and this is not caused by human intervention, and so on. And so I think on the one hand, stakes are the issue. On the other hand, I can't imagine living my life requiring the evidence that science requires in all aspects of my life, because I think I would never get anything done. I have to trust a whole lot of things in order for me to live an actual life.
Yeah, exactly right. I think it would be very difficult to approach your day-to-day activity with the evidentiary requirement of like a physicist. It'd be impossible to leave your house because you'd need to have all this data collected and all this evidence supplied to you in order to make a decision. So I think we create heuristic. We just know that mechanic is going to be trustworthy because we have a kind of shortcut by which we decide the trustworthiness of this particular mechanic because we have to live, right? We have to practically get along in the world. And so I think what counts as evidence changes based on the stakes, based on decision making, but I also think based on our commitment. There are some things that we are really committed to, like climate change, where we really care and we want good evidence and we'll seek it out. There's other things where we just want to buy a loaf of bread and not really worry that much about what it is we're doing.
Also, recently, we've come to learn how much we all rely on anecdotal evidence and the many ways in which that becomes problematic in many instances. Just to give an example, someone might say, oh, I hate that restaurant. And you say, why? Well, it's a horrible restaurant. They don't know what they're doing. Okay, why is that? Well, because one time I went in there and there was a hair in my food or something like that. Okay, is that evidence of the restaurant being bad? Is that evidence of the fact that they don't know what they're doing, or you had a bad experience? And that's okay when it comes to restaurants, but when it comes to whether vaccines are effective, then that kind of anecdotal evidence is really troublesome. And precisely in that discussion about vaccines, but also I think similarly about climate change, I've come to see how much we all rely on anecdotal evidence and how little we discuss the problems with anecdotal evidence. Why is your experience in this case not evidence of the thing you think it's evidence of?
Yeah, and I think in the Me Too movement, what we see is both the importance of, I won't say anecdotal, but testimonial evidence.
Right.
We see both the importance of it and the dangers of it. So one of the things to come out of the Me Too movement was this imperative, trust women. On the basis of a testimonial claim, we should trust that that person is telling the truth, and we don't require any kind of forensic evidence of it. The claim itself is, as you said before, self-evident.
Right.
But of course, all of us know if the standards are that low for evidence, then anyone could accuse anyone of anything. And this is a lot of the argument that you hear from people who complain about cancel culture, is that anyone can say anything and then someone gets canceled, and that ruins people's lives, et cetera, et cetera. And so we can't just take as a blanket imperative to trust testimony only on the basis of the identity of the testifier. So yeah, I mean, I think this is one of those instances kind of in between the bad restaurant or the restaurant that puts a hair in your soup and climate change. We have a very high standard of evidence and also recognize that it is deeply flawed in many ways.
So can I come at this from the other side? There's cases in which anecdotal evidence might be seen as being more valuable or more actionable. I'm thinking, for example, when you're buying something online and you have all these testimonials of people who've also bought this product, and you start reading these things, the more you read them, the less certain you are about your purchase, right? Mm-hmm. Because the more data you get, the less inclined you are to go to that restaurant or purchase that product. There's ways in which the overwhelming nature of these online testimonials just heap up evidence upon us in a way that we just want to know, okay, should I just do this or not? And I think that's a situation where you have the reverse of what we're talking about. You've just got way too much data that it no longer makes any kind of sense to you in terms of actually supporting what you are trying to decide.
You're saying that, David, makes me realize that evidence is what logicians call a so-right predicate. These would be things like bald. When exactly is someone bald? If they have 7 hairs, if they have 8 hairs, there are these terms we use like bald. They're on a sliding scale, and we know when someone's bald, but we can't tell you exactly when. And so you had a bad experience at the restaurant. That's an anecdote. Lee has a bad experience at the same restaurant. Now we have 2 anecdotes. Then there comes a point where you have enough anecdotes, and now that's statistical evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but if you are, for example, reading through the comments on a product and you don't find a uniformity in those testimonies, that would start to become something like statistical evidence in favor or against buying the product. And you decide to buy it anyway because, you got to make a decision. I'm not sure you would say in retrospect, I had good evidence for buying this.
Oh, right.
I think you would say, yeah, I bought this without evidence of it being good or bad. I just did. And I'm going to make my own decision about it.
And now that you say this, in conversations I've had with friends when they've made a purchase of something that was dubious, as a way of supporting their judgment of this product being good or bad, they will point to the evidence that's in the user comments. Well, it says in the user comments this, and this. So it's sort of, again, retroactive. They've already decided to acquire this object, and then afterwards, this list of user comments become a way to support what they've already decided to do.
I think the same thing happens in presidential elections, right? I mean, we have zero evidence, unless we're re-electing an incumbent, of anyone's ability to be a good president.
Right.
And so what we're doing is we're saying, I have a hunch, right, that this person or that person is going to be good at this job. Now, the standard of evidence there is really pretty low. I mean, it's not evidence. We have evidence of them being good at a lot of other things, maybe, or bad at a lot of other things. And we're inferring from that evidence that they might be good or bad at being president, but we don't have real evidence of their merit as a candidate.
But okay, let me push on that a little bit, because it seems like this is a problem inherent in the very notion of evidence itself. If evidence indicates something else, because of that difference and distance between the thing that is evidence and that thing that it's evidence of, there's always a space for something to go wrong. There's a space for a mismatch or something to go off track. I think that's the case when you're voting for a presidential candidate, that you took something as evidence for something else. So the fact that, someone went to Yale Law School is evidence that they'll be a good president, and then they turn out not to be a good president. I think you would say, well, I took this as evidence and I was wrong. And I wonder, isn't that inherent to all evidence as such? that gap makes it inherently tenuous.
I mean, I don't think it's inherent to all evidence. So, for example, if I wanted to say, is this sweater green? There's going to be a way to measure, how it appears on the light spectrum, and it's not going to stop being green at any point.
Can I just say that if you're colorblind, you might not take that as evidence. The color spectrum is a quality of our perceptual apparatus. And that perceptual apparatus is not necessarily homogeneous across all members of the species. So you can measure the wavelength of light as it reflects off of the sweater, but calling it green is a judgment that is made by someone who has the ability to see green versus like your dog who maybe sees more black and white gradations or something. So I do think there's a way in which that kind of evidence itself can be questioned in terms of how we describe it and that judgment that is made by calling the sweater green.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't want to get too bogged down in this, and this might be a ticky-tack point, but the scenario is I'm already claiming that the sweater is green. So I can see green.
Right. So then if you're in conversation with another person who doesn't see green, then they don't take that as a factual statement. Because even though you have evidence that it's green, they don't have access to that particular evidence that you're claiming is the support for your judgment of green.
Well, I have evidence that it shows up a particular way on the light spectrum, and I call that green. Now, the evidence is not going to change. You're right. It may appear to someone who is colorblind differently, or to my dog differently. And of course, my dog doesn't speak at all, so it's not going to call it anything. But I thought Rick's claim was that there's always this distance between the evidence for something and the thing that it is evidence for. Therefore, all evidence is unstable. And I wanted to say, I don't think that that's always the case. It's something wet that can be measured.
But wet is another so right predicate, right? So like you would say, oh, this is damp,
Does something contain carbon? Like, come on, guys, help me out here.
So I think this goes to like a fundamental point of Derrida's, that all these judgments are essentially an instability that gets pulled in one direction or another based on how we respond to various claims that are being made. But there is no stability in this. I think this idea of there being a gap in which things can be unstable is really what makes evidence interesting, but also makes it difficult because you just can't point to it and say, well, there it is.
Except for self-evident things.
Well, we can come back to self-evident things, but I was going to mount a vigorous defense of David's position until, Lee, you said something as an aside that now I can't quite get my head around. Okay, leave green aside, because David's point about green is we only call something green if we see green. And then retroactively we say, well, that's a fuzzy category. Let's define it as this wavelength on the spectrum of light. That's what we mean by green. But that means someone has already seen green. And so there's a judgment there already. Okay, great. But Lee, the thing you said on the side was, well, what about the claim, this contains carbon? I think that's a better example of your case than green, because I'm not sure how big of a gap there is between the claim, this contains carbon, and the evidence for it.
Yeah, I mean, just to olive branch this a little bit, David, obviously, it's not that there's no distance. I mean, maybe it's the case that in the near future, we discover different elements, right? And suddenly what we used to call carbon is something else. And we identify the chemical or material makeup of an object in a different way. So it's not impossible. But again, I was just trying to say, I don't think in every case that there's as much distance between evidence for something and the thing that it's evidence for as it might be if I'm trying to figure out whether to buy this roll of toilet paper.
But I think here an interesting point emerges, because the first thing that came to my mind was, well, that evidence of this containing carbon is based on whether your instruments of measuring are accurate. So there is a gap there, but it's a small one. But then I suddenly realized that once you enter the world of evidence, you could keep going in a circle. Mm-hmm. What is your evidence for the instrument being accurate? And then you tell me, well, it was calibrated. And what's your evidence for the calibration being accurate? Mm-hmm. In a sense, that evidence is, to borrow a phrase from Heidegger, without ground, or at least works in a circle, right? Yeah. So things can be evidence for other things, and those things might require evidence and so on. Mm-hmm. By and large, we're okay with a larger amount of uncertainty than we normally think we are.
And I think this point about measuring apparatus is absolutely crucial because if you look at the way a science like physics has evolved, now, when you're smashing things at the speed of light in particle accelerators, you don't see anything. Right. It's the instrument that measures it for you that provides the evidence. And so you have this mediation between the event that you are measuring and the means by which you measure it. And the more complicated the scientific experiment gets and the deeper we get into quantum states and things like that, the measuring apparatus becomes an absolutely crucial component in what is taken to be evidence.
And now we're back to the Sagan standard that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Yeah.
Hey, Hotel Bar Session listeners, this is Rick Lee. Do you know what kind of pillow I use or mattress I sleep on? No, of course you don't. And that's because we don't have any of those stupid ads for pillows or mattresses or any other crap that you don't even want. We are supported by you, our listeners. And if you want to keep our late night conversations flowing, why not do the equivalent of buying us a drink or giving us a high five? You could subscribe to our podcast at Patreon. That's patreon.com/hotelbarsessions. And you could subscribe at many levels. And hey, there's perks at those levels. You could get a coffee mug, or I might even call you out on an episode, or you could get early access to some of our episodes. There are lots of perks there, and we could really use your help. So go to patreon.com/hotelbarsessions and subscribe at any level you feel comfortable with. In the meantime, we'll see you back at the bar. I remember very clearly a moment in the confirmation hearings for Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh when Christine Blasey Ford had accusations of a sexual assault. Many of the senators kept pressing her, "How do you know this?" And what I found really interesting was the way she responded. She didn't pull out a piece of tattered clothing. She didn't point to someone else's testimony. What she pointed to was the facts of physiology. And she is knowledgeable about human physiology and the psychology thereof, particularly brain science. She kept saying, this is how the hippocampus works. Events like this are burned into your hippocampus. And she kept saying burned into in such a way that you can't be wrong about it. I thought that was a really complicated and yet interesting use of evidence. But I think it also shows some of the problems with evidence.
So I don't remember this particular moment in those hearings. Was the claim that the memory of the sexual assault was burned into the hippocampus of the victim, or that it ought to have been burned into the hippocampus of Kavanaugh?
Well, I think the second is something she would have claimed, but that's more of a moral claim than a scientific claim. But she was claiming it was burned into her hippocampus, and that this is just how human physiology works. So what I'm pointing to here is that the evidence is not what we normally would think of in a court of law as being evidence. So if you say, I murdered someone by shooting them, we want to see the gun. Or we want testimony that I heard bang and I looked over and Rick had a gun.
Where's the body?
Or where's the body, and so on. And so she didn't show the gun. She didn't show the body. What she showed was that she has, in a very technical sense, friend of the podcast, Emma Bianchi, uses this term, she has a symptom, and there is a direct link between this thing that she carries with her, namely the memory burned into her hippocampus, and the event. And that was evidence. I don't want to say that's not evidence, but I think it does show some of the intricacies of evidence that we've been talking about this entire conversation.
All of this gets at a fundamental philosophical issue that's really at the heart of Platonism, the difference between what really is the case and the various appearances that give symptoms of what really is the case. This idea that we could ever reveal the thing in itself as it is in itself. You see this when people are talking about these kinds of things. They say, well, we just know it's this, or this really is what happens. That is an attempt to try to point to the real thing behind the various appearances that are available to us. And so I think we're kind of playing a game with Platonism here. Evidence functions in a very Platonic mode, and this gap we're talking about is the Platonic gap between the appearance and the real.
I also think, though, that there has to be some kind of commonality in the standards that we're using for evidence when we're trying to demonstrate something to someone else or when someone is trying to demonstrate something to you. We all know this because we read student essays all the time. Often, students will, I think, fundamentally misunderstand what counts as evidence for a claim. Sometimes, often, they over-rely on anecdotal or testimonial evidence, like the very common papers that we get that will say something like, Duns Scotus is boring or Kant is confusing, right? Well, that you were confused is not evidence that it is confusing, or that you were bored is not evidence that it is boring. But more generally, it's sometimes difficult, when you say to students, provide evidence for your claim, to understand where to even go for that outside of their own immediate experience. And I think in the last, let's say, 10 years, that symptom has spread like wildfire in this country. And this is why we have this entire, do your own research narrative that somehow people said there just aren't standards that we all share for what counts as evidence. So just go do your own research. Just go believe whatever you want to believe using whatever standards of evidence you want to use. That, I think, is a problem for our democracy, a problem for our society, not to mention a problem for existing in the world with other moral agents.
And I think that even when students do realize that perhaps anecdotal evidence isn't a sufficient proof of the claim they're making, they then move to something else which they think is evidence of the claim they're making, something like, well, that's just human nature.
Yeah.
So like, what's your evidence that democracies require capitalism? Well, because humans are by nature greedy. And then when you say, well, what's your evidence for that? Now we're back to the green problem, right? The confusion comes up when they say, no, but I said it's just human nature.
Yeah, they're taking it as a self-evident claim.
Exactly.
Nature is always the stand-in here. Whenever you have something that you want to anchor in a reality claim, that's just the way it is. It's always nature. That's human nature. It's natural that we do this. You can think, for example, the way in which people had argued against homosexuality in the 19th and 20th century. It's not natural. Therefore, it's somehow against nature. And nature does a lot of heavy lifting here when we make these claims.
As do statistics, and I think increasingly statistics. Often, not just students, academics, regular people, I don't mean academics are regular people, I mean academics and regular people, will use statistics as evidence for a claim, even when the statistical evidence that they're pointing to has a tenuous relationship to the claim that they're making. Probably one of the best examples of this in recent years is that book, The Bell Curve, which claimed on the basis of statistical differences in test scores and graduation rates and many other things that African Americans were less intelligent than white Americans. Now, the problem there is not wholly with statistics. The problem there is with interpreting statistics and realizing what it is that statistics are evidencing, are showing, are making visible. And quite often what happens is that the claims that are being grounded on these evidentiary statistics are simply not supported by that evidence. Again, we saw this so much during COVID. Is it actually beneficial to wear a mask? Is it actually beneficial to get a vaccine? And then you just get people throwing statistics out, some of them entirely made up, fabricated, but just throwing statistics out without any real understanding of the relationship between statistical evidence and what it's supposed to demonstrate.
So you were saying it's a matter of interpreting the statistics, but it's also a matter of how the numbers are generated. Again, it has to do with the measurement, who's doing the measuring and how they're measuring. And oftentimes when you are looking at the raw numbers, those are not forward in your mind, right? That's sort of in the background.
And I think that there are some instances in which there are good reasons to make a claim or hold a position that is contrary to the statistical evidence. Like, for example, I'm afraid of spiders. The chances of any spider that I run into doing any real harm to me are like close to zero.
Right.
I'm in more danger when I get in my car every day than I am when I'm in the presence of a spider. But I've chosen to say, no, these are dangerous animals around me. That's fine because I'm only dealing with my own experience. And that's where I think people don't quite understand the importance of shared standards for evidence. If I'm just talking about myself, then if I want to believe that this is a terrible restaurant because one person I talked to found a hair in their soup, I can not go, and that's fine. But if I want to say this president is going to be a good president, and I want to convince other people or other people want to convince me to vote one way or another, we have to share some standards of what counts as evidence for that action.
I think, Lee, what you're pointing to is the fact that statistics in particular, I was going to say numbers, and it's also true of numbers, but even worse when those numbers then are used to look at probabilities of X versus Y and so on, that all of this gets so abstract. And if I don't know what a chi-square is, that all seems so out there. But you getting a hair in your soup is something that matters to me. And so I think it's the abstraction of the statistics that people are like, well, I don't know about that, but I'm going to trust my own experience. Two things come into play. It's the abstraction of the numbers and then a calling into question of the authority and, can I also just say, integrity of those who are producing the statistics, analyzing them, and so on. And so I think that our crisis in authority goes hand in hand with a movement toward anti-intellectualism, the coastal elites, which, strangely, none of us live on a coast, but the three of us are coastal elites, that the distrust of all of this makes shared standards of evidence almost impossible.
Maybe the problem is not evidence per se, but this notion of shared understanding of evidence. Mm-hmm. Maybe we're living in the nightmare of modernism, where everyone is a Cartesian subject and everyone has their own way of knowing the world and their own standards of truth and their own opinions. And we've made this individuation the cornerstone of our democratic process, forgetting that this is a shared process and that evidence is something constructed in collaboration with the rest of the people that we inhabit particular political organizations with, or these particular nations, whatever the case is, and that maybe we need to look at the individual as maybe the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And here, I've brought this point up many times in the podcast. The pragmatic tradition in philosophy, I think, was onto something, namely that these enterprises of understanding our world and understanding climate change and understanding whether someone's going to be a good president or not, that these are necessarily social, that is, non-individual. They rely on a common world.
Yeah, I think a commitment to those shared standards sometimes puts you in a position where you have to let those shared standards trump your personal experience. I have an anecdote about this, which is that I had a former colleague, and I'm going to use colleague in the broadest sense, right? So, well, I'd say that because I don't want people to look up who my former colleagues were and try to figure out who I'm talking about. But
right.
I had a colleague, a former colleague, who I had heard from many, many, many friends and colleagues was a predator type, was a misogynist, and had done some pretty terrible things to several women that I knew. This was absolutely contrary to my experience with this man. Like, it could not have been more contrary to my experience with this man. And I never thought, I don't believe you, to my women friends who were telling me their stories. I never thought, I don't believe you. I did sometimes say, that just is completely contrary to my experience with this person. But at some point, I had to say, what does saying, I don't disbelieve you mean? Like, how does that cash out, right? Am I just going to keep saying, well, sorry that happened to you, it hasn't happened to me? At some point, I had to say, no, I mean, even though I've had a really good relationship with this person and they've always been really good to me, I do believe that these stories are true. And I can't stand by and silently co-sign your behaviors.
Right. I was thinking of an opposite kind of position. I know someone who, at the beginning of the pandemic, when a lot of people were hospitalized and the main concern was our hospitals are overrun with COVID patients, people might not remember this, but emergencies were not being attended to because the hospitals were overrun. And this friend said, yeah, I was talking to my HVAC guy, And he said this whole thing is stupid because the hospitals just need to put in a reverse air pressure something. And they would have none of these problems. And I said to him, okay, you're talking about thousands and thousands of people who have devoted their lives to studying transmission of diseases, how hospitals work, how to prevent contagion, and so on. And you're going to tell me that like your HVAC guy has thought of this thing that no one else thought. Imagine all of the things you need to put aside in order for your HVAC guy to count as evidence for the claim that you're making. Mm-hmm. It's just too many things you need to put aside in order for that to be evidence. And so that's the opposite of what you were saying, Lee. Like, you had all of this evidence, and so therefore you had to put aside the one thing that was anomalous, namely your own position on this.
Yeah.
This goes back to what we talked about at the end of season 10 with simulation, this notion of coherence. You're looking for coherence across all these different opinions and positions. You're never going to get outside of these conversation to the thing itself. You're going to be stuck in everyone's perspective on what it is they are talking about, whether it be HVAC systems or vaccines, but you're looking for a kind of coherence across a number of different perspectives and positions so that you can make sense of these competing claims.
Although we do have to be really wary of our desire for coherence, because this is how we get myths and religion and all kinds of other stories that make things make sense.
Well, even conspiracies are a drive toward coherence.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly right. And also, it makes us unable to take seriously novel claims, like new discoveries. This is maybe a bit of a stretch, but I think this is a lot of the problem with higher education right now, that higher education has committed to this story that A, a college education is a good investment, and B, that everyone should go to college, or that college is for everybody.
Right.
Neither of those things are true. They're just not. There's just not evidence for either of those things. But the commitment to that story has become so prevalent and so unshakable that you keep finding all of these statistics that seem to support the value of a higher education and the fact that anybody can do it. And the universities are themselves changing what they do in order to make this a coherent story. And, people are suffering. Education is suffering.
Yeah, and then this goes back to a point we raised earlier, namely that in many cases, the fact that this coherence is the problem wouldn't matter, except as you were just pointing out, Lee, the stakes are really high in this because higher education is now being modeled in the image that was a projection, or to go back to David's point, a simulation.
Again, to circle back to where we started with this, we're thinking that these are all epistemological claims, but because we're talking about the stakes, it shows us that values are very much in play when we are engaged in these conversations. It's the assertion of a value that someone has of the college education that then makes this argument and this position, everyone should go to college. It's not empirically true, but it is true of a certain value, right? A certain way of thinking about the world and a certain way of valuing that experience.
But here then we get to an incredibly difficult issue, because if you think about the political situation today in the United States, I think a similar thing could be said about Hungary, perhaps Italy to a certain extent. There are people who say that unless we make a move toward fascism, we're going to lose what it means to be American or Italian or Hungarian. Mm-hmm. And then you have people who are saying we're about to lose what it means to be all of those things unless we prevent fascism. There, it seems like we have incommensurable values, and no amount of evidence is going to bring one side to the other. I think this is, on the one hand, a frightening situation, but it is the context in which people say, as Lee accused you of saying, David, everyone can make up their own evidence.
Hey, Hotel Barflies. We're not just sitting here sipping on cocktails and sharing stories. We're also bringing you extra fun on Facebook, the platform formerly known as Twitter, and YouTube. That's right. Follow us on Facebook for all the latest updates, behind-the-scene peeks, and some serious cool posts. Or follow us on the platform formerly known as Twitter at Hotel Bar Podcast, where you can enjoy our witty banter and updates. Drop us a tweet or join the conversation with other listeners. And don't forget about our YouTube channel, where we share all of our episodes. So if you're ready to help us keep the bar open past last call, hit that like button or follow and subscribe. It's like getting VIP access to all things hotel bar sessions. Thank you for all your support, and remember, whether you're on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, we've got a seat at the bar just for you.
I want to come back to what is, I think, our shared worry about the claim everybody can make up their own evidence. Many, many seasons ago on this podcast, we did an episode on what I call lazy relativism. The idea that what's true for you is true for you, what's true for me is true for me, and never the twain shall meet, and there's no problem with that. I think that now I might be inclined to say that a lot of people's commitment to that sort of lazy relativism is because they don't want to get into arguments. And people who don't want to get into arguments lose their investment in evidence, lose their commitment to evidence, and obviously, consequentially, lose their investment in shared standards of evidence. Yeah, this might be a chicken and egg thing, right? I'm not sure what comes first. Is it that we're lazy relativists and therefore we don't care about evidence, or we don't care about evidence and therefore we become lazy relativists? But I think that's at the heart of this refrain that we keep hearing, I'm not going to argue with you about it. Go do your own research.
There was a dissertation defense in our department, and the parents of the candidate came to the defense. And after we said, okay, you passed, we opened, a non-alcoholic champagne and congratulations. The mother came up to me and she said, I thought he was going to fail. And I said, why? And the father said, because you were all so angry. And I said, well, no, none of us were angry. And then it dawned on me, it was that we were arguing. And the argument to them was emotionally fraught and emotionally disturbing. And I think this is part of your point, Lee, is that it's very difficult for people to see the value of arguing about these things. We do it here on the podcast. I mean, just this episode, we've had 3 arguments. I think Lee and I have calmed down, but Lee used to say to me regularly, I could not disagree more.
And then you stop saying stupid shit, and so I don't have to say that anymore.
See, it's all fixed.
And I mean, for us in philosophy, the moment in which Lee says, I cannot possibly disagree more, is the moment when it becomes interesting.
Exactly that. And I think no one knows better than philosophers the absolute pleasure of someone disagreeing with you.
Yeah.
And actually, the absolute pleasure of being proven wrong. That is such a great experience. It's such a satisfying experience for someone to come to you with evidence that makes you concede their point, that makes you change your own mind. You feel like you've learned something in that kind of a situation. I don't know when that became so scary to so many people.
I'll say it's not just philosophy, it's other areas of human endeavor where this is crucial. You think, for example, of our justice system. It is predicated on an adversarial conflict between prosecution and defense.
Yeah.
And it only works because it is adversarial, because everyone is fighting really hard for their side to prevail in front of the judge. Or you think of scientific discoveries. Scientists who just agree with each other, that's not very interesting. You want scientists to challenge each other, to question the hypothesis and the support that they've offered for the hypothesis. And that's where new discoveries take place. So it's the conflict that many people find maybe abrasive, like these parents did at the defense, but that's where the fun stuff occurs. That's where the insight occurs, not just in philosophy, but across all these other areas of human activity.
What's at the heart of this question of evidence is values, and we have values precisely because of the common world, and those are the things most worth arguing over because of our commitment to the common world. I could give 2 shits about any loser who's saying, well, climate's change and it's not human intervention, and people say we're getting into a new... I could give 2 shits about that, except it matters. And so those are the things that are most worth arguing about. And I'm most disappointed in our inability to argue about values, or reluctance, if not inability.
Right.
Yeah, I think that most people are willing to give a lot more latitude to standards of evidence when it comes to moral claims than they are, for example, to legal or scientific claims. But even that latitude only goes so far. And one of the problems is that in our social lives, in our moral lives, in many cases, we don't share meta-narratives, right? We have vastly different understandings of what science is and what the value of science is, what religion is and what the value of religion is, what myths are or conspiracy theories are and what the values of those are, and how they should play into our evidentiary claims to one another. And I'm not sure that that is a solvable thing, but it does worry me deeply that we're not committed to trying to find common standards or common grounds, because that's when we're not able to have arguments. And without arguments, we're not going to go anywhere forward.
And I remember back in the 70s, the trope that the two things you shouldn't talk about in public or at the dinner table are religion and politics. And I get why people say that, but the thing that should most be talked about is politics.
And football.
And football.
I'm just kidding. Well, unfortunately, our bartender is tired of listening to us angrily argue with one another, and she has given us last call. But while she's grabbing our last drinks, let me ask you guys if you have any final thoughts on evidence. David, I'll go to you first.
We've been talking about this gap that makes evidence happen, right? The time at which you are in this sort of instability. And I'm just thinking of string theory. If you remember, string theory was all the rage in high energy physics for a while. And we kept asking physicists, so where's the evidence for string theory? Because it was predicated on mathematics and some hypotheses. The scientists were saying, well, the evidence will come. It just may take a couple hundred years for it to come. And we're still waiting. We're still waiting for the evidence. That, I think, really exposes this gap that we've been talking about, that evidence seems to need to be timely. It needs to at least happen within our lifetimes in order for it to be important. So it goes back to something we talked about with friendship. There's a certain finitude here that we have to reconcile, because if the gap is infinite, the evidence never really functions the way it should.
Rick?
When David mentioned string theory, I was suddenly thinking that I once heard a string theorist talk about how the universe is 10-dimensional. And I thought to myself, I don't think you know what a dimension is. But sticking with this idea of the gap, I want to bring this back to something that Lee said, namely that there are bigger and smaller gaps. And I think we need to be attentive to the size of the gaps when it comes to evidence. Also in relation to the stakes. And so to play off of the Sagan quote, the larger the stakes, the smaller the gap should be. And the smaller the stakes, then I'm really willing for there to be a large gap.
Yeah, cosign on that one. All right, guys, this has been a great conversation. Evidence of that will be available to our listeners when this comes out. So I will catch you next time.
Bye. Later.